Jim.
Thank you. Ms. McGivney, just before we, and Ms. Stewart, just before we broke, I was asking you about some questions, and we went to a couple of reports on profitability or economic analyses of the fisheries created through the pig feed program. Now, a number of the licenses that have been obtained to support these fisheries were all relinquished through a buyback program voluntarily. Is that correct?
Yes.
Has there been, I've been asking you about questions about an economic analysis of the viability of in-river demonstration fisheries. Has the department conducted an analysis of that type with respect to any of the conventional commercial fisheries in recent times for the purposes of doing a comparison?
I know that there are some reports that have been produced on exactly that question, the coastal fisheries, the economic viability. And those have been done over the years.
And has the department engaged in the process of doing any sort of comparison or comparative analysis?
I'm not personally aware if there's a comparison document that's been produced.
Ms. McGivney, are you?
No.
We could have our tab 38, please. Ms. McGivney, this document titled Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, that's a document you're familiar with?
Yes, I am.
I wonder if you could explain for the Commissioner, let's start, who drafted this document?
This document was drafted through a coordinated effort of work between the region and national headquarters. It was drafted from a series of different decks that were prepared to explore the ideas around this Aboriginal fisheries framework, and this is the culmination of that. So in terms of the actual people, I contributed to this. Robert Lamoran contributed to this. He's a national headquarters treaty policy person, and a number of other people contributed in different ways. But this was a document that was approved by our minister in the fall of 2009.
The drafting was a coordinated effort then between Ottawa and the Pacific region?
Yes.
Is the document intended primarily to apply to the Pacific region or to apply nationally?
It's intended to apply to BC.
And when was the document finalized? To the best of your recollection?
To the best of my recollection, it was in the fall of 2009.
Is this document, and I'm going to ask Mr. Commissioner, some of these questions may sound a little bit leading. I'm trying to tread cautiously to make sure we don't get into areas that cause Mr. East some concern. Is this document the culmination of work which took place through a process that's known as the Coastwide Framework?
Yes.
What's the purpose of this document?
The purpose of this document was a recognition that there were a number of factors that had changed the context within which we manage Aboriginal fisheries and the treaty negotiations. The policies that we've had in place for management of Aboriginal fisheries were brought in 1993, and then more recently, I've forgotten the date, I think it's 2007, the Integrated Aboriginal Policy Framework. Over this time, we've had new legislative context. The Oceans Act and SARA Act have come in. We've had new legal input in terms of different court cases that have come. Certainly the status of the resource has changed. There's been a big change in terms of environmental, climate conditions, etc. And on the treaty front, I think there's been a sort of a recognition that the programs that we had in place were meant to be a bridge to treaty, and with the objective that treaty was kind of the end point that we would be getting to. And I think at this point we've realized that the treaty process is going, has not moved as quickly as was originally anticipated, and that in the near future, we're still likely to have to deal with First Nations in treaty and First Nations out of treaty. And so the context of this report was to kind of bring that together, to review, look back at those policies in the context that we're going to have to move forward with managing the fishery in a context that has both treaty First Nations and non-treaty First Nations.
Was it the coast-wide framework process that ultimately led to this document?
Yes.
Okay. Wonder if you can, in general terms, explain to the Commissioner the process undertaken through the coast-wide framework.
The concept under the coast-wide framework was to look at what the overall expectation was at the end of treaties in terms of what the actual allocations might be for First Nations versus non-First Nations. The expectation that we needed to work towards a fishery that had room for all within it, and what the actual outcomes might be of Aboriginal shares versus non-Aboriginal shares. There was an element of looking at the changes within the treaty process and how fisheries arrangements were working within the fisheries within the treaty process, and how those would integrate with other processes for managing Aboriginal fisheries.
That process was an internal process conducted by DFO over a period of years?
Yes, and we also work closely with Department of Indian and Northern Affairs on this.
Throughout that process, there were many documents, perhaps thousands, which set out the progression of the department's thinking. Is that fair?
Yes.
Is this document a document? Tell us how this document relates to those other documents, and does it represent a summary of the conclusions reached by the department through that process?
Yes, this is a document that basically reflects the outcome of all of those other documents. It received the approval of our minister, and this is the current status of our policy with regard to this issue.
Does this document set out, in a general way or a specific way, the department's position as determined through the coast-wide framework process?
Yes, it does.
Does the document set out, in all ways that have been determined, the intended direction or proposed approach of the department to managing Aboriginal fisheries?
Yes, it does, to the point where we arrived at with that. I think the other thing in terms of timing is this document was approved in 2009, and that was shortly after that this commission was announced, and there's a recognition that there's still further development required of this, and that will be informed by the outcome of this commission.
Is this the most recent version of the document then?
Yes.
And it's in the form here as approved by the minister?
Yes, I believe so.
Either prior to it being approved by the minister or subsequent to that, has the department engaged any of the other resource users or First Nations in the consideration of this document or the conclusions reached in it?
Not directly on the specific document. However, the department has engaged with First Nations and commercial industry and recreational fishers as a regular course of business. This document, it reflects a lot of what came out through a variety of different reports and discussions, the Joint Task Group and the First Nations Fisheries Panel, which led to the Pacific Fisheries Reform Initiative of the department, that then also the First Nations Fisheries Panel and the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan. We have ongoing bilateral discussions with First Nations. And so all of those messages that come through those things were considered in developing this, but the actual consultation on the document has not occurred. The other thing I wanted to mention was also there was a process, I think it was 2009, called the Common Table, where Canada BC and the First Nations Fisheries Summit gathered to discuss elements around treaty and some of the roadblocks to moving forward in treaty, and some of the ideas that were brought forward with that were also considered through this process.
As a result of the conclusions or determinations expressed in this document, has the department created any new broad policies or amended any of the key policies related to Aboriginal fishing subsequent to this document being approved?
There's not been any formal changes at this point. I think that this lays out further work to be done, but there have not been specific policies that have been changed at this point as a result of this.
So the 1993 policy and the subsequent integrated Aboriginal policy framework remain in the form they were prior to this document at present?
Yes.
You made reference to the common table in 2008. I think my recollection is it was 2000, or 2009. I think my recollection is it was 2008. Are you?
Whatever
Okay.
the documents say, my memory is just, I wasn't sure which year.
We have a reference in the policy and practice report on page 111, Mr. Commissioner. Perhaps I'll just put that on the record. I'd like to turn now to the document and ask you some specific questions about it and just sort of move through it. Starting at the top under the fisheries environment, the first statement, fish is a key element of federal treaty offers, and it carries on from there into the first bullet, food, social, ceremonial allocation details are embedded in treaties, which of course are enduring. Does this document anywhere in it, the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, go any length to articulating in any more detail the department's definition of food, social, or ceremonial?
Further than this definition here, not that I'm,
Okay.
in the document, I don't believe so.
I'd like to move to the second bullet. It said, the negotiation and implementation of First Nations fishing arrangements in BC have become increasingly challenging. In recent years, several issues have emerged, including, and it's the first two on here I wanted to ask you about. Fish allocations in recent BC treaties have raised concerns that if allocations are extrapolated to all groups, opportunities for non-commercial and recreational fisheries would be significantly curtailed. Is that a concern that you became aware of in the early stages of finalizing some of the treaties?
This is a concern that was raised more publicly.
Sorry, I'll stop you. I see Ms. Chavez has a
Yeah,
comment.
Mr. Commissioner, just for the record, my friend read in non-commercial and non-recreational fisheries, but it's non-Aboriginal commercial and recreational fisheries.
Thank you for that correction. I misread the paragraph. In any event, it is as it's stated on the document, and if perhaps you could just articulate the concern that was raised there in the department's response.
The concern had been raised by others, that given the existing treaties, if that was to be extrapolated to other Aboriginal groups, that there may not be enough allocation for non-Aboriginal purposes. That was one of the concerns that had been raised. The department has looked at, through the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, there's an element that does address allocations looking at a broad endpoint. None of the materials that the department had suggested that this would in fact be a concern, but the information that was being raised publicly was that there was an interest in having an identification of what the end point might be.
Was that one of were these concerns one of the factors that led to the department engaging in the coastwide framework process?
Yes.
I'm going to come back to one of the bullets there later on, but at this point I'd like to jump down to the heading B, Aboriginal Fisheries Framework. And it says the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, the framework, and I'll just stop there. That reference is to this very document, is that right?
Yes, it is.
The Aboriginal Fisheries Framework provides a more coherent, policy-based approach to addressing Aboriginal participation in BC fisheries and managing Section 35 rights both inside and outside of treaties. So there's reference to the framework providing a more coherent and policy-based approach. Is it this 2.5-page document that provides the more coherent and policy-based approach?
I think this document lays out the basic framework, and there's more work to be done to lay out that policy.
How does this policy in this 2.5 pages provide a more coherent and policy-based approach to addressing Aboriginal participation in the fishery?
I think it's the context that we would be managing to a future that includes both treaty and non-treaty First Nations, and that we would look at the policy within the policies within that context. There's key principles within this. There's having the broad allocation endpoints identified, and the options of looking at new approaches to manage that would lead to providing this clearer policy-based approach to moving forward. So there's still more work to be done to support getting to that.
Okay, I take it from this bullet, what you've just said, that the department has determined that a more coherent and policy-based approach was required.
Yes.
What was the problem with the old approach that the department identified?
The challenges with the old approach was the context that I indicated earlier, that we had been working towards a paradigm essentially where treaties would provide all the certainty and the clarity, and the programs that we had were just an interim measure to get there, and that now we're recognizing that treaties aren't going to come along as quickly, and some First Nations may not even be interested in treaties, that we have a future that is going to involve both treaties and non-treaties, and we need to review our policies and programs in that light.
Jumping down to the second bullet under B, and I'm just going to read the last sentence as a lead into the last bullet. The objective of the framework is to achieve fisheries arrangements that are, and then...
Sorry, I'm not sure where you are here.
I'm sorry. Second bullet under the heading Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, B on the first page. That's right.
Oh, okay.
And this is just articulating the objectives of the framework. And if you just go to the last dash under that bullet, deliverable, manageable, and cost-effective over the long term. Do I take this to be an indication that the department expects this new approach to be more cost-effective over the long term?
That's the intent.
How is the department intending to achieve a more cost-effective approach to managing Aboriginal fishing?
The approaches that we may take in terms of updating the policy and the new fisheries arrangements, we are looking to evaluate those in the context of those various options, and a number of options are identified within this framework. We need to look at those in the context of cost effectiveness and the fact that that we need to develop things that are cost effective and manageable.
Can you give me any specific examples of what might change to lead to a more cost-effective approach?
I think
major structural changes that are contemplated?
Part of the challenge that had been raised was the costs related to some of the treaties where they were very smaller communities, aimed at smaller communities. The treaty process is based on groups self-identifying, and initially one example is the Nuu-chah-nulth had entered into the treaty process as a group of, I think it was 13 or 14 First Nations. Over time, some of those First Nations did not agree to the AIP, and in the end we ended up with a treaty with 5 of those First Nations. And now I believe there's at least one of the First Nations within the Nuu-chah-nulth that are seeking treaty on their own as well. So moving from broader groupings of First Nations to more individual ones was creating costs associated with the treaties, and there's also costs associated with the specific management arrangements that were being worked within treaty. So these were some of the things that were brought into consideration coming forward with the thought that we need to be looking at processes that look at how we can manage, how we're managing the fisheries as a whole, and what are the support processes that we need to do that.
If we can flip over the page to page 2 of this document under the heading Allocation Strategy to the 4th bullet, please. Just enlarge that bullet. Start with the first. BC First Nations allocations, FSC and commercial, provide through existing arrangements amount to about 30% of salmon. I take it this 30%, there are many years when that number wouldn't be an accurate reflection of the number that were allocated to First Nations.
This number reflects averaging over a certain period of years. As you've pointed out, there have been some years, and I believe 2009 was the year where there was very little FSC harvest, but whatever was harvested was primarily First Nations, if not all First Nations. So when you look at this on a year-by-year basis, because of the fluctuation of salmon stocks there and the priority of the food social ceremonial access, there may be some years where in very, very low runs, the First Nations share is a greater percentage. So this is looking at a series of years. I can't recall the actual years at this point, but it would depend on the period of years that is being looked at, reflecting sort of those relative abundances.
Right, so if we look at 2009, that number would be 100%.
Yes, and it would not include commercial. It would even communal commercial. It would just be FSC.
And in 2010, it might be less than 30%.
It would have been. It might have. Yeah, actually, I don't know what the percentages were in 2010.
So there's wide variability depending on, in part because of the priority of FSC, from year to year if we look at it on a percentage basis.
Yes, looking at things on an annual basis need to will reflect the relative abundance of the stocks.
The department has, through this process, identified an endpoint, which is a number that it intends to be allocated or proposes to be allocated to First Nations. Is that fair?
The strategy proposes overall percentage for salmon, and another percentage for non-salmon.
There is a number somewhere.
A percentage number.
Yes, and that's what it's expressed as a percentage.
Yes.
Is expressing it as a percentage cause difficulties given the wide variability of stocks and the need to prioritize FSC?
Definitely looking at what that percentage means and how that percentage would be implemented is complex. There's a number of different salmon species, for instance, just speaking of salmon, and as you've indicated, the split between food social ceremonial allocation component of that and the commercial component of that is complex. There's not only different species, but there's different watersheds and different interests by First Nations within that. So how to actually implement and apply that is a very complex process, just taking into account a number of different factors.
Just to make sure we're clear, in that bullet, the strategy establishes a coast-wide allocation outcome of XX% for salmon. That XX, does that include both FSC and commercial?
Yes, it does.
Now, as the department has done there with allocation by percentage, several of the treaties which have either been finalized or are in the process of being negotiated contain allocations by way of percentage.
Percentages in treaties that have been allocated within the treaty, the domestic, it's referred to as the domestic allocation, is usually identified by a formula that would involve percentages at certain run sizes and is often capped at some run size level.
Has the department experienced difficulty where the percentages are very small with fluctuating in-season numbers, managing by way of a percentage with some groups?
It becomes the challenges of managing the fishery because of the fluctuations is a challenge all the time in terms of achieving allocations for all groups. for whatever groups that might be, First Nations, non-First Nations, et cetera. But we work with the best information possible and try to achieve the objectives.
One example of difficulties that arose of this type might be seen with the Tsawwassen fishery in 2009. Are you familiar with that example?
I recollect it vaguely, but I'm not really close to it, but
Okay.
I can perhaps.
Well, let me bring up the document
Okay.
and refresh your memory. In the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework is the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 1426.
If we could turn to our tab 49, document page 11. So McGivney, this is the Tsawwassen First Nation post-season fisheries report for 2009. You're familiar with this document?
Yes, I've seen it.
I'm not asking if you remember every word. I know you see a lot of documents. Just looking at the final paragraph, it articulates an example of some difficulties that arose, and it appears through no fault of the Tsawwassen fishers, who appear to be making their best efforts to fish according to the terms of the treaty. It says the Tsawwassen FSC allocation for sockeye was difficult to determine in 2009 because of the large changes in Fraser in-season estimates of Tsawwassen FSC sockeye allocation. 1,610 computed just prior to TFN's second sockeye fishery on August 25th, 2009 was higher than the final Tsawwassen FSC sockeye catch. The preliminary postseason estimate of FSC sockeye allocation was 830 based on CTAC. So the estimate of what their allocation would be went from 1,600 down to 800, causing them to have overfished their allocation unknowingly, because at the time they went fishing it was thought to be higher. Is that an example of some of the difficulties that are experienced by the department managing by percentage quotas, especially when the percentages are very small and given to different user groups?
I think what this is reflecting is not so much the challenge of managing to the different percentages, but it's reflecting an element that was included within the Tsawwassen Treaty, which is overage and underage accounting, which means that looking sort of after the fact, you've got to readjust based on what the expectations were. And with this reflects part of the challenge with that element of looking at overages and underages, because the rest of the fishery is not managed on that basis. So if the whole fishery was managed on looking at some past end of season accounting and accounted for in that way, then there'd be systems for working overages and underages out. But right now, because we haven't moved to an entirely share-based fishery, the challenge is in coming back to that, is looking post-season and reevaluating. So managing to small shares for small groups has some challenges with it because of just the operational nature of looking at managing to those levels. But I think this also reflects the challenges with the overage and underage clauses associated with the treaty.
Thank you. An overage was not applied in this instance, is that correct? I can perhaps just...
I can't recall. I think the discussions occurred.
Perhaps I'll just read you the last few sentences of this page. Given the large uncertainty about the abundance of sockeye returning to the Fraser River in 2009 and the record low sockeye catch by Tsawwassen First Nation fisheries, the JTC, which is I think the Joint Technical Committee, recommended that to the JFC that the 2009 Tsawwassen allocation for sockeye be set equal to the TFN sockeye catch, i.e. no carry forward for sockeye. The JFC accepted this recommendation. So there was no overage applied.
There's no overage applied. But the discussion comes in because of the fact of trying to look at that clause and evaluate whether that clause is applicable or not.
So the allocation was exceeded, no overage was applied, and the allocation was adjusted to reflect that.
Yes. And the fishery was managed based on the best information available at the time.
Okay. I'm going to move now to ask you a few questions about co-management. Through the work done through processes like the forum and the roadmap and through the coast-wide framework process, has the department arrived at a place where it is committed to engaging with First Nations in a co-management relationship with respect to management of Fraser River fisheries?
Sorry, your question is the department committed to managing in a co-management
Yes.
relationship with First Nations?
Yes.
I believe so. There's a number of different areas where we work with First Nations to try to achieve that.
Is this a clear direction in terms of a commitment that's come to you from senior management of DFO?
It's a commitment that's documented in the Integrated Aboriginal Policy Framework, which outlines co-management, working together towards co-management. It's the basis for the ARAM program. It's also a key component of the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy program. And also, it's a key element brought forward in the new Big Fee initiative.
Are you able to articulate for the Commissioner the extent of the department's commitment? To what extent is the department committed to involving First Nations in management of the fishery? And to what extent does the department, where does the department sort of draw the line and say, this is what we're hanging on to and managing ourselves? Or has the department landed on those matters?
And I think this relates back to some of the, basically, an understanding of what is co-management, what does it involve. Certainly from management of the fishery, there are a number of different elements of co-management. There's the information about the fishers and information about the stocks. There's the planning processes for the fisheries and the actual implementation of the fishery and the post-season evaluations. So there's a broad spectrum of elements around co-management, and I think there's different areas that we work with First Nations in AFS. We work with First Nations at a bilateral level to do a number of projects and provide some of that information, some of the catch monitoring, some of the stock assessment information, etc. So it's a difficult question in terms of saying what extent. Certainly in terms of co-management runs a full spectrum of sort of information and decision making and at what level things are occurring. And certainly I think the department is willing to enter into arrangements with First Nations to try to work together to come out with jointly agreed approaches and plans.
Okay. If we could have Exhibit 1187, please.
Mr. McGowan, I think Stuart had something she wanted.
Yes, certainly, please. While we're going there, please.
I was just going to add that the PICFI initiative has resources available and has as one of its objectives to facilitate co-management, not only between the department and First Nations, but between First Nations and First Nations, between multi-stakeholder and First Nation collaboration. So looking at various aspects of co-management.
Thank you. If we could go, please, to page 20 of this document. That's the document page number. And I'm looking at the top left quarter of this page under the heading co-management. Is this still the department's operating definition of co-management?
This is one of the department's approaches to it. There's been a lot of work, as Julie says, more recently looking at developing a co-management framework and trying to come up with different, coming up with definitions. This definition is a a sort of a visionary definition here. It's looking towards the future of sharing authority for fisheries management. Currently, our Fisheries Act, the Fisheries Act does not limits the minister, it provides the minister with absolute discretion with regards to fisheries management decisions. There's other elements, though, that First Nations can bring forward in terms of authorities within their own jurisdictions. For instance, the ability to authorize the fishers that are going to fish on their behalf.
The first bullet, the last sentence, says co-management will eventually encompass the sharing of authority for fisheries management. Does that contemplate the minister giving up his ultimate authority, that phrase?
It does, and I think at the time there had been some proposals being forwarded to revisit the Fisheries Act that might address that co-management element.
Is there a further reflection of that thinking in the second bullet? Says it is the policy of DFO to shift from top-down centralized management of fisheries resources by the department to a shared stewardship of the resource that includes the devolution of certain fisheries management authorities to resource users. Is that a further articulation of the department's, at least at the time this was drafted, intention to provide more authority to resource users and perhaps take it away from the minister?
Yes, and I think it also is still to some degree reflected in our current modernization of the fishery, trying to make fishers more the shared stewardship element of it. So yes, I think it is, and it's still supported with current policies.
If we could go back to the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, please. Which was, I believe, the last exhibit marked as Exhibit 1426. On the first page, bottom bullet. It's our tab 38 if that assists. Bottom of the page, under the heading key, page 1, under the heading Key Principles. The framework establishes the following overarching principles, and then skipping ahead to the first bullet, the authority of the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to manage fisheries and fish habitat is respected. Do you take that to be the department resiling to some extent from the articulation of the definition of co-management contemplating sharing of authority?
I don't see it as being conflicting. I think that there's a lot of areas where there can be shared responsibility with regards to the whole spectrum of co-management that we've been talking about, but in the I think the Fisheries Act, as this identifies, the minister still has to have the authority at the end. Many of these decisions or varying decisions and management of the fishery, if groups can come together and come to consensus and recommend that to the minister is quite likely to, if that's sort of the broad view, most likely to support a decision, unless there's some other factors that haven't been brought into that consideration. But I don't see this as being contrary to that. I think groups can still work together to come to ideas. Ultimately, if there's a broad range of interests in the fishery and different views, there needs to be someone to make a final decision to move things forward. There's a timing in terms of fisheries management decisions, and things have to move forward.
In terms of moving forward to strengthen co-management relationships, from your experience over the years dealing with Aboriginal fishing and in the fisheries generally, what's your assessment of the importance of effective catch monitoring and enforcement and resource management, having those in place to support a co-management relationship?
They're very important. They're part of the again, it comes back to what do we mean by co-management, but to me, co-management has that broader implication. What do we need to manage the fish? We need to have stock assessment information, we need to have good catch monitoring, we need enforcement, we need agreement amongst the various participants.
Right now, the approach to co-management or involving First Nations in decisions or consultation about the fishery is accomplished through ARM bodies and through AFS to some extent. Is that right?
Yes.
Moving forward, as the co-management relationship develops, what's the department's intention with respect to these structures and these organizations? Is the department contemplating a wholesale reorganization? Is it contemplating rolling these organizations into the relationship? Is it contemplating any change at all? Is it contemplating adding to it?
I think it's the relationship and the co-management framework and structures are evolving, and they're being developed jointly with First Nations. I don't think the department, they need to be built jointly to have joint support and buy-in. Our programs are resilient enough that we can adjust the current structures if that's necessary and if that's what comes out of that joint work together.
Fairly significant resources are presently expended on the ARM program and through AFS. Is that fair to say?
Yes, the ARM budget is in the magnitude of $6 to $7 million in Pacific region, and the AFS co-management component of the budget is around $14 million.
Those funds are used at least in part to support some of the bodies and structures that interact with the department.
Yes.
And I take it you're aware, at least at present, maybe you can answer this question. At present, are you aware of any of those bodies that take the position that they can engage with the department on behalf of their member organizations?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
It's a question about representative authority. Do any of these bodies engage with the department on behalf of their member nations or member bands?
Yes, I would say some do, but it's variable in terms of the support that they might have internally within their organizations.
Okay. Do you have? Maybe I'll leave that there. I just have a moment, Mr. Commissioner. Increased involvement of First Nations in management of the fishery or other resource users in management of the fisheries will decrease or increase expenses for the department, increase costs for the department?
I don't believe there's been a specific analysis done on that.
I'm not aware of any specific sort of bottom line comparison of costs. However, I would point out that the benefits for the department of being in relationships with stakeholders and First Nations in terms of buy-in to management processes and that sort of thing is also very important. So there's got to be a balance there.
Do you see the move to co-management as at all impacted by the ability of the department to implement the wild salmon policy?
Sorry, does it affect the department's ability to implement the wild salmon policy?
No, does the extent to which the wild salmon policy has or has not been implemented impact on the department's ability to move forward with co-management relationships?
I think they go hand in hand. The need, in order to implement the wild salmon policy, the more cooperation and collaboration that we can have with the various interests in the fishery, the more likelihood we were going to have the sustainability of the stocks and the support for the wild salmon policy. So I think it's very, very closely linked.
Ms. McGivney, you've made reference to some numbers and budget numbers. I'm just going to take a moment now and enter some exhibits that provide a little more detail about that. If we could go to our tab 52, please.
Mr. McGowan, before you move on, you were dwelt on tab 49. Did you want that marked? It's
If it could be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Yes, that'll be marked as 1,426.
Thank you.
27. Or 27, I'm sorry.
Sorry, 27.
27, correct.
So I'm at our tab 52, which is a spreadsheet, and if we can get the whole of it on the screen, that would be helpful.
Do our best.
The whole of the first page.
Okay.
Now this is the Pacific Region budget 2005-2006, and if we look down under fisheries management, the budget for your program in 2005, for Aboriginal policy and governance in 2005-2006 was a little over 26 million.
Yes.
And if we skip to the last page of the chart, for 2009, 2010, by 2009-2010, the Aboriginal policy and governance budget had increased to 56 million. Is that right?
Actually, the budget is in the column before that. That's the
I'm
actual
sorry.
spending, so it had increased to 60.
So the budget had increased to 60. The actual spending had increased to 56.
Yes.
And to put that in context, resource management is really receiving in the neighborhood of 20 million.
Yes.
Okay. And conservation and protection also in the range of 20 million.
Yes.
Can you explain the what accounts for the increase of some 30 or so million dollars?
Okay.
over that period?
The major part of that increase is the introduction of the PIC fee funding to support the increased access for First Nations. There's also some component of additional PIC fee funding for co-management agreements, as well as during that period, the funding for ARM has been held nationally and wasn't included in the previous. It would be transferred after the fact, so it wasn't included in the earlier years. During this time, I think it's a $5 million more were added into the Pacific budget for ARM. It wasn't increased, it was just where the money comes in the table. So that explains the increase.
Okay. And we asked you to provide us some information, a bit of a breakdown of that, which you've done. It's found at our tab 58. Maybe just before we go, we'll mark this last document as the next exhibit.
1,428.
Thank you. Tab 58, please, Mr. Lund. This is a breakdown of how that 56 million was allocated. Is that fair? This document on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. That could be the next exhibit, please.
1,429.
And if we look at some of the numbers here, some of this AFS money, for example, AFS co-management, the ARM and PIC fee money, is not spent directly by DFO, but provided to First Nations for expenses associated with those activities. Is that right?
Yes, everything under the grants and contributions is not money that is direct to DFO. It's for that.
Thank you. And if we could just go back then to tab 50, our tab 54, marking this one on our way. I did already, thank you. Mr. Giles, did I mark that last tab 58? 58.
Yes, you did.
Thank you. And this is, again, some further budget information which the department prepared for the commission. Is that fair? Dealing with funding provided to Aboriginal organizations under AFS?
Yes.
Okay. If that could be the next exhibit.
1,430.
Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions for this panel.
I wonder if I could just before, I guess Mr. East is next, but just before he does, just to help me understand, going back to tab 38, which has now been marked, and I'm not sure I know the exhibit number. Is it 1426? Is that
1426, correct.
And either panel member can just help me with this. Turning to that document under new fisheries arrangements, I'm not sure if there's a page 2, right? And then, of course, on page 3, there's moving forward. In that document, under that new fisheries arrangements, there's reference to regional or watershed ecosystem approaches, reliable and consistent fisheries monitoring, reporting, and so on. There's a number of items mentioned there, including broader collaborative fisheries arrangements, and so on. And then there's under moving forward, there's mention of consultation, accommodation, and so on. What I'm just trying to understand, and perhaps these panel members can address it, the Commission has heard a great deal of evidence around many of these subjects from DFO employees and others with respect to the consultations and discussions that have been going on over the past many years relating to these topics. Do I understand that to the extent that those discussions and consultations have been going on between DFO and First Nations and stakeholders, that those discussions have been informed by the coast-wide framework, which you tell me is essentially summarized by the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework? In other words, when DFO managers or senior managers have interfaced with First Nations or stakeholders to discuss co-management, catch monitoring, stock assessment, wild salmon policy, that those discussions have been informed by the principles and the objectives that are articulated now within this document called the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, which you testified to was reflective of the coast-wide framework.
I think it's probably the reverse. Those discussions have informed this development of the framework to this stage.
I see. It's the other way around. So all of those discussions then have been captured in some way or another within the language that is now used in this document.
The concepts have supported the development of this document.
Can I just then follow up with a question Mr. McGowan asked, perhaps the panel, but either one of you? To the extent that I've heard evidence for months now about a variety of those subject matters being a work in progress. For example, wild salmon policy not fully implemented, discussion still going on around trying to define what co-management means, and other examples I'm sure you could give me much more. Do those discussions and those understandings and those arrangements and the implementation of some of those subjects have to be completed before this description of new fisheries arrangements and moving forward can actually take place?
I think all of those processes there's an evolution. There's an implementation. I'm not sure there's a final sort of process with any of that. Consultations will evolve over time. The wild salmon policy will be implemented over time, and this Aboriginal fisheries framework will be revisited based on the input from this commission and moved, adjusted, potentially adjusted and moved forward as well. And so I think fisheries continue to be managed, and we work with the policies as in the state that they are, and they're going to continue to evolve over time. I wouldn't want to say that any particular piece needs to wait until another piece is completed. I think it's important that things are moving forward.
So all of those discussions you explain have informed this document, but this document is not setting timetables or driving the conclusion of those processes which are ongoing.
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. McGowan, is there anything arising out of that answer that you wanted to follow up before Mr. East?
Mr. Commissioner, perhaps I'll let Mr. East go now and consider whether I have anything in re-examination.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, Mark East for Government of Canada. I'm with my colleague Charles Fougere. I have allocated to me 70 minutes, and I see we're very close to lunch. So what I propose to do perhaps is ask a question following on your theme about the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, following upon the discussion that Mr. McGowan initiated, and then perhaps continue the rest of my examination after lunch. So that maybe I could perhaps ask a question or two now. If we could go to, I believe, I'm similarly failing to remember the exhibit number, but I believe it's tab 38, the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework document.
1426.
1426, thank you. And I'd like to go again to the discussion about the status of this document, and this is a question for Ms. McGivney. Under the heading of B on the first page, and I just wanted to go to the second bullet, and it says, and I'll just read the first line of the second bullet. The framework will provide clear direction to address fisheries components of treaties and improve linkages from fisheries arrangements inside and outside of treaties. Now, Mr. McGowan asked you a question about whether this document, the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework, represents the, I guess, the final culmination of the coastwide framework. I just want to be clear on something, though. Is it intended that this document will be the final product of the coastwide framework, this particular 2.5-page document?
No, there's definitely more work to be done. There's more looking at the allocation strategy and implementation of that, looking at these options that are identified for the new fisheries arrangements and some of the options identified under the moving forward. So there's still more to come.
And following upon your answer from last time where you referred, and we talked about this as a framework, is it fair to say then that this is a document that expresses an intention as to where DFO wishes to go on these issues?
Yes.
Okay. I also wanted, and maybe this is my last question before the lunch, I just wanted to, on the same page, under the same bullet, but the third sub-bullet, and this is one that was read into the record by Mr. McGowan, but I want to go into it a bit further because I want to read the entire bullet into the record. And it talks about deliverable, manageable, and cost-effective over the long term. And then the words they want to add are, in order to mitigate the risk of post-treaty litigation. Are you able to speak specifically about the nature of the post-treaty litigation that it was a concern that was raised in this bullet?
My recollection, I know it was a while ago, was that it was related to the treaty arrangements that were being negotiated, and that if there wasn't adequate funding, or if the situations were such that the conditions of the treaty couldn't be deliverable, we needed to kind of look at that in the context of the change in terms of the resources and the fish resource great fluctuations that we're observing today, as well as the costs that came associated with treaty and the requirements to meet the stock assessment and the catch reporting, etc., to ensure that there's adequate funding to be able to deliver on that.
And in the modern treaty context, have there been concerns raised by First Nations, I guess generally, about issues relating to treaty implementation, modern treaty implementation?
Yes, there have been. I think there's been a number of treaties where existing treaties whereby First Nations have come back indicating that the implementation funds were not adequate to meet the obligations of the treaty.
And is that the context, is that one of the contexts, or is it the context for this bullet that we're just discussing?
That was the considerations there.
That's my questions. Perhaps it's a good time to break for lunch, Mr. Commissioner.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.